Everyone called the young orc the thief's daughter and said no one would ever love her until the richest man in Red Hollow fell for her in secret and discovered her father was innocent all along. The first thing Lara remembered about the morning they called her father a thief was the smell of coffee. It had been dark outside. The lanterns in the kitchen were still lit, casting long orange shadows across the wooden floor. Walter had been sitting at the table with his hands around his cup, the steam curling up past his face when the sheriff knocked on the door. Lara had been 7 years old. She hadn't understood the words they used. Stolen cattle, missing shipment, witnesses. But she had understood her father's hands, how they went still, how they slowly placed the cup down, very carefully, as if he already knew that everything in their small, warm world was about to break. 22 years had passed since that morning, and still, whenever someone in Red Hollow said the name Walter, they said it the way people say the name of a disease. The sun had barely cracked the ridge when Lara arrived at the eastern fence line of Oakwood Farm. She carried a worn canvas sack over one shoulder and wore boots that had been resoled twice. The hem of her dress was already darkened with morning dew. She moved fast. She always moved fast. Slow workers got noticed, and getting noticed in Lara's experience only ever meant trouble. She was 25 years old, half orc, half human, and entirely aware of what that meant in a town like Red Hollow. Her skin was a deep, smooth green, like the inside of a river stone polished for years by water. Her ears curved to soft points just above her dark hair, which she had braided loosely to keep it from her face during work. Her eyes were the color of warm honey, though no one had ever told her that. No one told Lara things like that. What they told her was, "Your father was a thief." What they told her was, "The orc can do the heavy rows." What they told her was nothing at all, because silence, she had learned, was its own kind of message. She had worked at Oakwood Farm for 8 months. It was the longest she had stayed anywhere since her mother died. Before that, she had moved through 6 different properties across the valley, never lasting long enough to learn the names of more than 2 or 3 people. Most employers tolerated her just long enough to realize who she was. Then they found reasons. Oakwood was different only because it was large enough that most people didn't care. The farm had hundreds of workers, dozens of fields, and a fighter named Vernon, who ran everything with an iron fist and a short temper. Vernon didn't care who your father was. He cared whether the work was done, and Lara always did her work. She reached the cornfield and began, without waiting for instruction. Her hands moved through the stalks with the kind of practiced certainty that comes not from speed, but from years of knowing exactly what needs to be done. Row after row. The sun climbed. The heat settled onto her shoulders like something alive. She was on the 14th row when she heard boots in the soil behind her. New boots. She could tell by the sound. A little uncertain, not yet broken in by this particular ground. She didn't turn around. She had learned not to pay attention to new workers. They came and went. Most lasted a week before Vernon found a reason to send them packing. But something about the sound made her pause, just for a moment. She straightened her back, glanced sideways through the corn. A man, tall, broad shoulders that spoke of real work, even if the rest of him looked like he hadn't slept. His hair was dark, carelessly pushed back from his face. His jaw was set. His eyes, she caught just a sliver of them, were dark brown and quiet in a way she didn't often see in men arriving at Oakwood. Most new workers arrived with something to prove. This one looked like he was searching for something. Lara turned back to the corn. "Not your business," she told herself. "Keep moving." She kept moving, but the sound of those boots stayed with her the rest of the morning, the way a song stays long after the music stops. His name, according to the documents Victor had carefully forged, was Owen Cole, 30 years old, previously employed at a cattle operation near Dustfield. No family, no debts, no trouble. Nathaniel had read the papers 3 times before leaving the main house, making sure he knew every invented detail well enough to repeat it without hesitation. He had left before dawn, while the house was still dark and Edith was still sleeping. He had not wanted to see her face again. The old woman had packed his bag the night before without saying much, which was somehow worse than if she had argued. She had folded each worn shirt with the same care she gave his good ones, and when she handed him the bag, she had pressed her hand flat against his chest for one brief moment. "Come back," she had said. That was all. He had walked to the East Workers' Quarters through the cold morning air, carrying his own bag for the first time he could remember, and tried to feel like a man named Owen. It was harder than expected. Vernon had looked him over with the disinterest of a man who had seen 1,000 others like him. He scanned the documents, asked 3 flat questions, and pointed toward the East Cornfield before Nathaniel had finished answering the last one. There was no welcome, no explanation of the work, just a direction and an expectation. Nathaniel found he respected that, even if Vernon himself inspired no respect at all. The work, however, was something else entirely. By the 2nd hour, his hands were raw. By the 4th, his lower back had developed an ache he suspected would last for days. He was not a soft man. He rode hard. He built with his own hands when building was needed. He had spent enough time outdoors to know physical effort. But this was different. This was sustained and repetitive and unrelenting in a way that left no room for dignity. He thought, somewhere around the 6th hour, about the men who did this every single day of their lives. He had always known it abstractly. Now he felt it in his shoulders. He was nearly through a difficult section of the field where the ground was rocky and uneven, when the heat hit him in a way he hadn't anticipated. It moved up from the earth and down from the sky simultaneously, and something in his body simply refused. The world tilted. His vision went white at the edges. He stopped. He pressed one hand against a cornstalk to steady himself, and for a moment he stood very still, breathing carefully, trying not to fall in front of a field full of strangers. No one came. He had not expected anyone to come. People who looked after themselves in this kind of place had learned, hard and early, that no one else was going to do it for them. He understood this. He accepted it. And then someone came. She appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision, the green-skinned woman from the row beside his. He had noticed her earlier, not because she was remarkable in any obvious way that the other workers had pointed out. They had mentioned her name with contempt and moved on, but because she worked with a kind of focused precision that was almost beautiful to watch. No wasted motion, no complaint. Just the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since made peace with the labor. She was holding a tin cup. She crossed the distance between them without ceremony, without announcement, without the performance of charity that Nathaniel had sometimes seen in people who wanted credit for their kindness. She simply held out the cup. He took it, drank. The water was warm, almost hot from the container she carried. But it was the most purposeful thing he had tasted in months. He looked up. Her eyes, when he met them, were not what he expected. Light brown, almost gold, with a quality of careful attention in them. The look of someone who observed much and disclosed little. There was no pity in them, no calculation either, just a person giving water to another person who needed it. "You'll find the shade break at the far end," she said quietly. 20 minutes. Vernon times it, but not closely. Then she turned and walked back to her own row. Nathaniel stood there for a moment longer than he should have. The heat was still pressing down. His back still ached. His hands were still raw. But something had shifted. He didn't have a name for it yet. He finished the water, set the cup down where she could retrieve it, and went back to work. The barracks smelled like old wood, sweat, and something faintly metallic that Nathaniel couldn't identify. 14 men slept in the same long room, on narrow cots with thin mattresses and single blankets, regardless of the night temperature. Nathaniel lay on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and listened. The men talked before sleep in the way that men who work hard always talk, directly, without much filtering, because they were too tired for pretense. They talked about the heat, about the strain in the south field, about a horse that had gone lame. They talked about food, about pay, about how the rations had been shrinking for the past year and a half. Used to be 3 hot meals, said a voice near the far wall. "Now it's 2 and the second barely counts." "Vernon keeps what he wants," another voice answered. Silence followed that statement. The kind that meant everyone agreed, but no one wanted to be the person who said it out loud. Nathaniel stored the words carefully. Then, from the cot nearest to his, a younger man's voice. "You hear they're blaming the Orc girl again?" A low, weary laugh from somewhere. "What now?" "Vernon says tools went missing from the west shed. Says he saw her near there last Tuesday. He says a lot of things. Doesn't stop people from believing it." The conversation moved on, but the name stayed, hanging in the dark like smoke, the way names do when they're attached to a story that has been told so many times it has become part of the air. Nathaniel turned onto his side. He had known, intellectually, that Lara's situation here was difficult. You could tell from the way the others gave her a wide berth during the day, not violently, just reflexively. The way people sidestep something they've been told is dangerous, but hearing it spoken in the dark, hearing the easy casualness of it, the way her guilt was assumed and her innocence never even raised as a possibility. He had felt something very similar once. Not the same. He understood that. A man with land and money being betrayed by a woman who loved his fortune was not the same as a woman with nothing being slowly crushed by a community's indifference. But the feeling beneath both, the specific, quiet devastation of being seen as something you are not, of having your true nature buried under someone else's story about you, that he recognized. He thought about Amelia. He had not thought about her in weeks, and he resented that she had returned now, in this place, in the dark. But she had. Her voice, the way it had sounded that afternoon behind the closed door. "He's not difficult to manage, just slow to trust. Once we're married, it won't matter." Her laugh. Light and certain, the laugh of a woman who had already decided how the story ended. He had stood outside that door for a long time before walking away. He had cancelled the wedding with a short letter and no explanation, because any explanation would have required him to say aloud what he had heard, and saying it aloud would have made it true in a way he wasn't ready for. He lay in the barracks and let the memory pass through him without catching on anything. Then he turned his mind back to Lara. He thought about the way she had moved through the field, the way she had handed him the cup. No presentation, no expectation, the way her eyes had looked when she told him about the shade break. Like someone who had learned all the important things about a place without ever being welcomed into it. The next morning, he arrived at the cornfield early. She was already there. He had expected nothing, a nod maybe, or the polite distance of 2 workers maintaining the professional separation that protected everyone. But when he reached his row, she glanced up briefly and said, "Gloves. Vernon won't give them out, but Old keeps extras near the north pump." Just that. Then she went back to work. He stood for a moment looking at his blistered hands, and then walked to the north pump. Old was there. A man of 70-something, white-haired and lean, with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had decided long ago not to waste energy on urgency. He looked at Nathaniel, looked at his hands, and pulled a spare pair of work gloves from a canvas bag without being asked. "She sends everyone," Old said simply. "Doesn't like seeing people hurt when it's preventable." Nathaniel put on the gloves. "Why doesn't she get herself a better pair?" Old smiled at some private thought. "She doesn't ask for things," he said. "Never learned how." Nathaniel walked back to the field. He thought about that for the rest of the day. Old had a way of telling stories that made them feel like weather, like something that had already happened and would keep on happening and couldn't be argued with. He didn't dramatize, he just described in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. It was on a Sunday afternoon, some weeks into Nathaniel's time in the workers' quarters, that Old first mentioned Walter. They were sitting on the low wooden bench beside the north pump. The day was free, or as free as days got at Oakwood. Vernon didn't schedule work on Sundays, but there was always something that needed doing, and the men who didn't find something to occupy themselves were likely to find Vernon occupying them. Nathaniel had been sharpening a fence-post stake with a hand tool, mostly to have something to do with his hands. "You ever hear of a tropero called Walter?" Old asked. Nathaniel kept sharpening. "The name's come up." "She's his daughter." "I know. I mean the real Walter," Old said. "Not the one people talk about in town." Nathaniel looked up. Old was watching the horizon with the same expression he always wore. Patient, slightly distant, like he was listening to something beyond the immediate landscape. "I knew the man 20-some years before they arrested him, knew his roots, knew his reputation. Every rancher between here and the Northern Pass trusted Walter with their shipments. He never lost a single head of cattle in 20 years of driving. Never. People change." "Some do," Old agreed, "but the man who was convicted of stealing that shipment, the way they described him, the things they claimed he said and did, that wasn't Walter. I knew Walter. What they described in that courtroom was somebody's invention." Nathaniel set the stake down. "Who benefited?" he asked quietly. Old glanced at him, a brief, assessing look. "That's the right question," he said. "Asked it myself for years, never got an answer I could prove." They sat in silence for a while. "She knows what people think of her here," Old said eventually. "She's not naive about it, but she stays because this is the longest she's been anywhere since her mother passed, and because," he paused, searching for the right word, "because leaving would be like admitting it's permanent, that there's no place anywhere where she just gets to be a person without a story attached to her." Nathaniel picked up the stake again. "Her mother," he said, "died about 4 years after Walter went to prison. Grief and shame, mostly. Lara was 16 years old, and entirely alone." Nathaniel thought about that for a moment with a kind of precision, holding the fact still long enough to feel its full weight, then setting it aside, because he was learning that when it came to Lara's life, each individual detail was heavy enough to stop your breath if you held it too long. He thought again about the name in the old documents. Walter. And the papers he had seen somewhere in the farm's financial records, not recently, but years ago during one of his early reviews of the property's history. He had not paid attention then, because the name had meant nothing. Now it meant everything. The connection he couldn't quite grasp was still there, just beyond the edge of his memory. He needed to look at those records. But first, there was Sunday afternoon, and a woman who was probably at Willow Creek at this exact moment, washing clothes with the same efficient grace she applied to everything, and thinking, he was fairly certain, that no one in this world was particularly glad she existed. He set down the stake, stood up, and walked toward the creek. When he arrived, she was there. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, then returned to her work without expression, but she didn't move away. He sat on the bank a few feet distant, took off his boots and let his feet hang over the water. After a while, she spoke. "You don't talk much," she said. "Neither do you." A pause, then quietly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "No," she agreed. "I don't." Willow Creek became theirs without either of them deciding it. It happened the way most real things happen, not with a declaration or a plan, but through repetition so natural that the absence of it would have been strange. Sunday mornings, Lara came to wash clothes and think. Nathaniel came because the creek was quiet, and because when Lara was nearby, the weight that lived permanently in his chest seemed to ease slightly, the way a tight joint eases in warm water. They talked about small things first, the quality of the soil in different sections of the farm, the strange behavior of the mule in the west field, whether it would rain before the end of the month, then bigger things, gradually. The way water rises in conversations when two people are genuinely paying attention to each other. She told him about her childhood on the road, Walter had been a man who believed that children learned best by seeing things. He had taken Lara on drives from the time she could sit in a saddle without sliding. She had seen the northern ranches in the autumn, when the grass turned the color of fire. She had eaten at tables across a dozen different settlements, learning which roads turned impassable in the spring floods, which merchants were honest, which sheriffs were fair. He knew everything about this country, she said, her hands still moving through the washing. Every route, every crossing, every family that kept their word. People hired him not just to drive cattle, but because he knew things maps don't tell you. Nathaniel listened. After he was convicted, she continued, and her voice became careful in the way voices become careful when approaching something fragile. Some of the men who'd worked with him tried to speak for him. They came to the court. But by then it had already been decided. The judge was friends with... She stopped. Friends with who? Nathaniel asked. She shook her head slightly. I was a child. I only heard pieces. My mother wouldn't tell me everything because she was trying to protect me from it. She wrung out a cloth and laid it on the bank. What I know, she said, is that my father never stole anything in his life, and that someone in this valley needed him to be guilty of something. Nathaniel watched the water. I believe you, he said. She looked at him then, a direct, assessing look that lasted long enough to mean something, as if she were checking the statement against some internal measure of truth. Most people, he realized, said things like, I believe you as a comfort, the way you pat someone's shoulder. He had said it the way you state a fact. She seemed to understand the difference. Why? She asked. Because the description doesn't fit. Everything I've heard about your father from people who actually knew him contradicts the man they convicted. She was quiet for a long moment, then, You've been listening. Yes. She turned back to the water. Her hands were still. Most people don't, she said softly. They sat together by the creek for a long time after that, neither speaking, the water running past them in its indifferent and ancient way. A kingfisher appeared briefly on a low branch across the bank, looked at them both, and was gone. In the afternoon, when the light was going amber and long, Lara stood to gather her washed things. She paused before leaving. Owen, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said. Just that, just the two words, spoken quietly, as if they were difficult to say, as if she didn't often have reason to say them. He watched her walk back toward the workers' quarters, her dark hair moving in the evening breeze, and understood with absolute clarity that he was in serious trouble, not the kind that could be solved by investigation or confrontation or any of the strategies he was accustomed to deploying. The kind that comes when you realize someone has gotten past the walls you spent years building without ever appearing to try. He thought of what Edith would say, about time most likely. There are things that show you who a person really is, not the big moments, not the performances put on for an audience, but the private ones, the ones with no witness and no reward. Nathaniel found the cedar pasture by accident. He had been following the eastern fence to check on a section Old had mentioned was rotting, a task he had volunteered for because it required solitude and he needed to think. The fence was in worse shape than expected, which meant he was moving slowly, and moving slowly meant he saw things others walked past. He saw the smoke-grey horse first. She was pressed against the fence near a stand of scrub oak, one foreleg angled in a way that made Nathaniel's chest tighten immediately. Horses that stood like that were horses in serious pain. Abandoned or forgotten by the look of her, her coat was dull, her ribs visible beneath it, and the grass within her reach had been eaten down to dirt. He was about to move toward her when he heard a voice, soft, methodical, speaking in a low, unhurried tone that wasn't quite a murmur and wasn't quite singing. Something between the two, the sound of a person in private conversation with the world. He went still. Lara was crouched beside the horse, her back to him, her hands moving slowly over the injured leg with the kind of practiced attention that meant she had done this before, many times for creatures that couldn't thank her. She had brought clean strips of cloth, a small jar of something that smelled, faintly across the distance, of dried herbs. Her hair was loose, unusual, she always kept it pinned for work, and it hung forward over one shoulder as she bent to her task. "Easy," she said to the mare. I know it hurts, but if we leave it like this, it gets worse." The horse was trembling slightly, the way horses tremble when they are in pain and trying to be brave about it. Lara's hands moved steadily, unrushed, the mare's trembling eased by degrees. "Nobody's going to bother you here," Lara told her. "I'll come back tomorrow, and the day after." Nathaniel stood perfectly still behind the scrub oak. He had seen kindness in his life. He had received it from Edith, who expressed it in meals and pressed shirts and 30 years of quiet loyalty. He had witnessed it in his brother Victor, who showed it through logic and planning and the firm conviction that protecting family was the highest form of love. He understood those kinds of kindness. This was different. This was a woman with nothing to spare, no status, no security, no certainty that tomorrow would be better than today, giving her free hours and her careful hands to a horse that no one else had thought worth saving. There was no audience, there was no calculation, there was just the work, and the animal, and the absolute sincerity of someone who could not pass suffering by even when passing by would have cost her nothing. He thought of Amelia. He thought of the way Amelia had once pressed coins into the hands of a beggar child at the market, turning to him with a bright smile immediately after, making sure he had seen. The comparison arrived complete and final, and Nathaniel did nothing to push it away. He waited until Lara had finished and stood and gathered her things, and he waited until she had walked far enough that she would not see him emerge from the trees. Then he stood beside the fence for a long time in the fading afternoon light, his hand on the weathered post, staring at the old mare who was already, somehow, standing a little straighter. Something in him had decided something. He wasn't ready yet to name it, but it had decided all the same, with the quiet finality of things that are true. He turned and walked back toward the barracks, and his mind was already moving, toward the financial records, toward the documents stored in the main house, toward the name Walter and the name Charles, and the question that had been growing in him for weeks like a fire finding its shape. He made a decision before reaching the barracks door. He would send word to Victor in the morning. It was time. The accounting ledgers for Oakwood Farm were kept in the main house, in a locked cabinet in the study that had been his father's before him. Nathaniel knew the cabinet. He knew the lock. What he didn't know was how to get to them without revealing who he was. He had not anticipated this particular problem when he had designed his plan. He spent 3 days thinking through it before an opportunity presented itself in the form of Victor. His brother arrived on a Thursday afternoon under the pretext of inspecting the farm's South Field operations, a visit plausible enough that even Vernon accepted it without suspicion. Victor moved through the workers' areas with the practiced ease of a man used to authority, and he did not look at Nathaniel when they passed each other in the East Field. That evening, after dark, Victor left an envelope behind the loose stone beside the north pump. Inside, a key, and a short note in Victor's handwriting. Study cabinet, 3rd shelf, brown leather binder. Records from 15 to 18 years ago. Father marked certain pages. I don't know why. Be careful. That night, when the barracks had quieted and the men's breathing had settled into the rhythm of deep sleep, Nathaniel slipped out. The main house was dark. He moved through it the way he had moved through it 1,000 times. Through the back entry, across the kitchen where Edith's domain smelled of cold iron and dried herbs, down the hall to the study. He did not use a lamp. He knew every floorboard. The cabinet opened cleanly, 3rd shelf, brown leather binder. His father's handwriting appeared on several pages. Marginal notes, small, careful asterisks, dates underlined with a single pen stroke. His father had been a man who noticed things and marked them without fully knowing why. trusting that the significance would emerge later. It emerged now. There were records of a transaction, a cattle purchase conducted under Oakwood's name, 18 years prior, through an intermediary. The transaction had been routed through Walter's driving operation before the final paperwork was completed. If someone had needed a credible target, a tropeiro with access to large cattle movements and no powerful allies was exactly the kind of man you could make disappear without too much resistance from the community. And the destination of the purchased cattle, the ranch to which they were ultimately transferred, was marked clearly: Oak Ridge Farm, Charles. Nathaniel stood in the dark study for a long time. The purchase had occurred 3 months before Walter's arrest. And who would believe a man like Walter over a man like Charles? There was more. His father's asterisks pointed toward a second document, a deposition from a ranch hand at Oak Ridge Farm, taken down during the original investigation, and then, apparently, never entered into evidence. The hand's testimony contradicted the primary witness account, completely. Nathaniel read every page twice, until the information was fixed in his memory with the permanence of something that cannot be unfixed. He put everything back exactly as he had found it. He locked the cabinet. He stood for a moment in the dark study and thought about Lara at 16 years old, standing at her mother's grave with nothing and no one in a world that had already decided her story for her. Then he thought about Vernon, out in the dark, making his quiet transfers with his quiet partner. And something shifted in him, not toward anger exactly, though anger was present, toward a kind of cold, absolute clarity. That same night, before returning to the barracks, he passed the south fence line. In the darkness near the storage shed, he saw exactly what he had suspected: Vernon moving in the shadows, exchanging a heavy sack with a figure on horseback. The transaction was brief, deliberate. The figure rode off without a word. Nathaniel watched until both shadows disappeared. Then he turned back toward the barracks, carrying the full weight of everything he now knew. It was going to end. All of it. The night Old came to find him. Nathaniel was sitting on the edge of his cot, unable to sleep. Old sat down on the next cot without being invited, in the way of men who have lived long enough to dispense with that kind of formality. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his own hands. "Vernon has been watching her," Old said. Nathaniel went still. "Nights," Old continued. "I've seen him twice, near the women's barracks after everyone's gone in, just standing, just looking. Started about a week ago, from what I can tell." Nathaniel said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "I'm telling you because I'm old, and I can't do what needs doing," Old said simply, "and because I believe you're a better man than you've told anyone here you are." The statement landed quietly. Nathaniel met the old man's eyes. Old looked back at him with the expression of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time. "I don't know what your real name is," Old said, "but Owen Cole doesn't move the way a man moves who's been a farmhand his whole life, and he doesn't look at the farm the way a man looks at someone else's property." Nathaniel held the silence for a moment. "Is she safe tonight?" he asked. "Tonight, yes. But Vernon's getting bolder." From that night forward, Nathaniel slept in intervals. He woke before the 3rd hour, checked the perimeter of the women's barracks from the cover of the storage shed, waited until he was satisfied, then went back. He did this without telling Lara, because telling her would have required explanations he wasn't ready to give. He also sent word to Victor that same morning. A short, careful note slipped behind the loose stone at the north pump, where Victor's man passed every Thursday without fail. The note said only, "Be ready. Bring 2 deputies. Wait at the south boundary. I'll send word when." During the days, he continued to work beside Lara, continued to meet her at the creek on Sunday mornings, continued to carry the growing weight of everything he had not said. She noticed the change in him. "You're tired," she said one Sunday, watching him from across the water. "I'm fine." "You're not." She studied him in that direct way she had. "Something's bothering you." He looked at her. The creek moved between them unhurried. A hawk was tracking something in the high grass on the far bank. "Lara," he said, and then stopped. He had come close several times to telling her everything. Each time the words reached the surface, and then something held them back. Not cowardice exactly, but fear of the specific. Fear of watching her face change. Fear that what they had built together on these Sunday mornings, conversation by quiet conversation, trust earned in small increments over months, would be revealed as something constructed on a false foundation. He did not want that. He was not sure he could bear it. "What?" she asked. He looked away. "I want to tell you something. When the time is right." She was quiet for a moment. "I've learned," she said carefully, "that when people say that, the time is never right." "It will be," he said. "I promise you." She looked at him for a long moment with those honey-brown eyes that missed very little. "All right," she said finally. But something in her voice was careful now in a way it hadn't been before. A small withdrawal. A door left open but no longer propped. He noticed it. That afternoon, the shout went up from the main yard. Vernon's voice carrying across the farm with the force of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Nathaniel heard it from the creek path and began moving before the words fully registered. By the time he reached the main yard, the scene was already arranged. Sacks of merchandise spread across the ground. Workers gathered in a circle. Vernon standing at the center, his broad body positioned for maximum authority, his expression the expression of a man who believes himself untouchable. And Lara. Standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, very still, her face carefully neutral in the way it went neutral when she was frightened and had decided not to show it. "Found near the women's barracks," Vernon was announcing, "and we all know whose barracks those are." The crowd shifted. Old heads turned toward Lara. Nathaniel watched the movement, the reflexive, practiced return to a story that had been told so many times it required no evidence. He moved through the crowd. He said her name first. "Lara." Everyone turned. "She didn't take anything," he said. His voice was calm and even and loud enough to carry. "I know because I've been watching. I've been watching Vernon." The yard went quiet. Vernon's face did something complicated. "You don't have any standing here, Owen. My name isn't Owen." He reached into the inside of his worn jacket and removed what he had kept there since the first day. The small gold ring his father had given him. The one with the oak branch carved into the band, the one that every long-term worker on this farm would recognize immediately. He held it up. "My name is Nathaniel. I own this farm." The silence that followed was absolute. Vernon went the color of old chalk. Lara's eyes found his across the yard, and what he saw in them was not relief, not anger, not the tears he had half expected. What he saw was something he didn't have a word for, something that looked like the moment just before a verdict when everything depends on what comes next. "He has been stealing from this farm for 3 years, Nathaniel said, still watching Vernon, his voice carrying the cold clarity of someone who has decided. "Cattle, tools, supplies, all diverted through a night contact at the south fence line. I have documentation, I have dates, and there are men in this yard who saw the same things I saw and said nothing because they were afraid." He looked at the workers. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Vernon moved. It was the move of a man with nothing left to lose. Fast, reckless, reaching for Lara as a last lever of control. His hand closed on her arm. Nathaniel was already moving. The struggle was brief, not because it was simple, but because Vernon, in the end, was what he had always been, a man whose power came entirely from the compliance of others. When that compliance was withdrawn, all at once, by an entire yard of workers who had been waiting years for permission, he had nothing left. 2 of the older farmhands stepped forward, then 3 more. Vernon's hand released Lara's arm. He was restrained, loudly protesting, and then very quiet, in the way of men who understand that the scene has shifted beyond recovery. Victor arrived with 2 deputies at the south gate before the hour was out. He had received Nathaniel's earlier note and had been waiting at the south boundary since midday, exactly as instructed. The timing was not luck. It was preparation. Nathaniel had suspected the confrontation was coming. He had not told Lara. That was the truth he had to carry through the long remaining hours of that day. The first of many truths he had been carrying too long in silence. He looked for her immediately after Vernon was secured. Through the scatter of voices and movement in the yard, through the questions from workers who had suddenly remembered they had observations to share, through Victor's controlled but poorly concealed satisfaction at the outcome. He looked for the one face that mattered. She was not in the yard. He found her as the afternoon was giving way to evening, up on Cedar Hill, beneath the wide oak whose branches spread in every direction like something that had decided, a very long time ago, to stay. She was sitting with her back against the trunk, her knees pulled up, her face turned toward the valley below. He sat down a few feet away. She didn't look at him. "How long?" she asked. "From the beginning." A long pause. The valley below them was going gold in the lowering light. Somewhere in the middle distance, a dove called and was not answered. "Owen," she said, and the name in her mouth now sounded like what it had always been. A placeholder. A space where a real person was supposed to be. "I'm sorry," he said. "I want to explain it, all of it. But I want to say that first, because the rest of it only means anything if you believe that." She was quiet. He told her everything. He told her about Amelia, about standing outside a closed door, and hearing his own life described as a transaction, about cancelling a wedding and not explaining why, because explanation required a kind of vulnerability he had not known how to offer. He told her about the months afterward, the growing certainty that no one in his world saw past the land and the money to anything worth knowing. He told her about Victor's frustration and Edith's quiet sorrow, and the night he had looked at the ceiling and understood that if he stayed as Nathaniel he would never know. "I wanted to find someone who could love what I actually am," he said, "not what I own." She listened without interrupting. Her face was turned toward the valley. "And I found that," he continued, "in you, before I meant to, before I was ready for it." He paused. "The lie was not about you. It was never about you. But I understand that it doesn't matter. A lie that touches someone is still a lie." The sun was low now. The oak above them moved slightly in a wind that hadn't been there before. "My father," she said finally. Her voice was different when she said it. Not controlled, not careful. "I know," he said. "Tell me." He told her what he had found in the documents. Carefully, completely, leaving nothing out. The cattle purchase, the routing through Walter's operation, the deposition that had never reached the court, the name Charles, written plainly on the destination line of a transaction conducted 3 months before her father's arrest. She was very still throughout. When he finished, she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, just a moment. Then she lowered it and breathed out slowly, the way you breathe after something has been confirmed that you always suspected but never had words for. "He wasn't guilty," she said. "No," Nathaniel said. "He wasn't." The word no sat in the air between them like a stone placed down after a long time of holding it. Below them, the farm's lights were beginning to appear, lantern by lantern, the workers settling into the evening routine, the world turning toward its ordinary rhythms. A horse called from the lower pasture. Smoke rose from the kitchen, which meant Edith had arrived and was already at work. Nathaniel waited. He did not fill the silence. He had learned, in those months of listening and watching and saying less than he knew, that some silences asked for patience and not resolution. This was one of them. This was Lara sitting with the weight of 22 years and the knowledge that her father's name was clean, and it could not be rushed. After a long time, she turned her head and looked at him, not with anger, though the hurt was still there, visible and honest in her eyes, not with the careful withdrawal from before, with the expression of someone deciding something, the same quiet finality he had felt weeks ago, watching her tend the grey horse in the cedar pasture. "You're going to fix it," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "Publicly, completely. His name will be restored. Charles will answer for what he did." She nodded slowly. Then she looked back at the valley. "I named her Rosebud," she said. He blinked. "The mare. She's doing better. The leg is healing." He looked at her profile against the last of the light, the soft curve of her jaw, the slight points of her ears, the dark hair moving in the evening wind, and felt something in his chest that had been locked and tight for 2 years open, simply and completely, the way a gate opens when someone finally brings the right key. "Rosebud," he repeated. "It seemed right," she said. She had a hard start. They sat for a while longer on Cedar Hill as the sky went from orange to rose to the deep violet of early night. The first stars appeared. Below them, the farm settled into itself, into its rhythms of fire and sleep, and the quiet animal sounds of a place that was learning, slowly, to be more than it had been. When Lara finally rose, she didn't leave immediately. She stood beside the tree for a moment, looking at him. Then she extended her hand, not for comfort, not as a grand gesture, simply as an offering, the kind you make when you have decided to trust someone again, not because trust is safe, but because the alternative is too small a life. He took her hand. They walked down from Cedar Hill together in the dark, toward the lights of the farm, toward Edith's kitchen, and Victor's measured relief and the long necessary work of truth being brought back into the air where it belonged. 6 months later, Charles stood before a magistrate in Red Hollow. The deposition was entered into evidence. The transaction records were presented. 3 men who had stayed silent for 22 years found at last the courage to speak. Walter's name was cleared on a Tuesday morning in late spring, with the valley smelling of new grass, and the sky the particular blue that only arrives in that season. Lara stood in the courtroom with her back straight and her hands still, and her face open, and when the ruling was read, she closed her eyes for one moment. Nathaniel stood beside her. They were married the following autumn, in a ceremony small enough to fit under the oak on Cedar Hill. Edith made the cake. Old stood at the front of the small assembly and said nothing, and then said everything that needed saying in a few short sentences. The farm's workers, human and orc alike, gathered at the edges of the hill as the light fell golden through the leaves. Their son was born the following spring. They named him Walter. He had his grandfather's eyes. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-bound Legacy.